Our year today was with Dr. Raymond Slavin, who is Emeritus Professor of Medicine at St. Louis University. He's a long-term member of the American College of Physicians, where he has been elected to mastership, and has had a long and fruitful career as a allergist and immunologist, doing both clinical care and research in St. Louis. Good morning.
Good morning, Dan.
Can you tell us a little bit about your early life? Where were you born and grew up and so on?
Yeah, born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. My parents owned a furniture store, my Slavin furniture, best for less. And my mother and father went to work every day, 6 days a week, 3 nights a week. My only sibling was 16 years older than I. So I was basically an only child. When I was 2, he went off to Ohio State. He never lived with us. I was fortunate to be in a wonderful school system, Cleveland Heights, Ohio. I was also extremely active in my temple. If I'd had a little more confidence, Dan, I think I would have been a rabbi. But the thought of dealing with boards of directors steered me towards medicine. So I was very fortunate to grow up in a middle class, very comfortable situation. I turned to medicine largely because I enjoyed science, and I very much enjoyed dealing with people. There was no real epiphany that I had. I admired greatly the physicians that tended to my family, our internist, our surgeon, our pediatrician, ophthalmologist. And so that's why I chose medicine. At 18, I went off to the University of Michigan. Incredibly, it was the only school to which I applied in 1948. That was common, and had a wonderful experience there. I was a waiter in a fraternity house, which I was a member of. The University of Michigan offered a extremely progressive program called pre-professional studies, in which I got all the requirements of medical school out of the way in the first 2 years. And then the last 2 years were literally changed my life in terms of introduction to music, art, philosophy, aesthetics. And in my senior year, I met the woman who would become my wife. We were not quite ready for marriage. And so she stayed in Ann Arbor, got a master's degree in stringed instruments, and I went to St. Louis U medical school. At the end of my first year, we were married, and she moved to St. Louis with me. I lived in a comfortable $90 a month apartment in Clayton, and it was a very good experience. In those days, medical students work very hard. The first 2 years, just the abundance of lectures. Last 2 years were clinical. I remember a surgical service when I was on call every other night. And the night I was off, I usually got home at 10 o'clock. It was actually in medical school that I thought that academic medicine would be a good area for me to concentrate on. So I, at graduation, our first son was born, and we moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, for a rotating internship at the University of Michigan. The state of Michigan at that time required rotating internships. So I saw a number of different departments. I could not make up my mind between internal medicine and pediatrics. And so I decided to get the 2 years of the Berry plan out of the way. At that time, physicians were required to to serve 2 years, and I saw a number of physicians who were pulled out of their practice actually to enter the armed forces. So I entered the Berry Plan, and we spent 2 wonderful years at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, the Army Electronic Proving Ground. I went as a general medical officer. My chief called me in one day after I'd been there about a year and said he'd been transferred to Germany, and I was now in charge of the allergy clinic. And it was interesting that I encountered a number of Signal Corps people who had made every effort to move to Arizona because of allergy in their family. Well, I soon found out that the grass allergy in Arizona was equivalent to ragweed in St. Louis. And so I saw a lot of patients. Alberta, my wife of 55 years, was also allergic, and it was actually during my internship at Michigan that she was started on allergy injections, and I administered them. So I decided that it would be an interesting field. So we returned to St. Louis after 2 years for internal medicine residency. And there were 2 allergists in practice that were particularly good mentors for me. Clem Sullivan, who was the first board certified allergist in St. Louis, and Bob Belinsky. And so applied for fellowships in allergy. There were not many at that time, and ended up at Northwestern and had an extraordinary experience there. Ample time for research, good mentors, and we enjoyed Chicago greatly. So after 3 years of fellowship, it was time to apply for an academic position. And I hope I don't offend anybody in the listening audience, but we applied to every medical school in the country that did not have an allergist, except for Mississippi and Alabama in 1964. That were 2 places I didn't want to go. And Dan, it was extraordinary. I had published during my fellowship. I presented at several national meetings, and I did not get one positive response. At that time, allergy was really regarded as voodoo medicine. And the responses from the places to which I applied varied from, we'd love to have you, but we have no money, all the way to the University of Indiana chairman, who said, "Dear Dr. Slavin, in answer to your letter, no, we do not have an allergist. Second, 2, no, we do not intend to have an allergist." So there I was, you know, a wife, 4 kids and a dog, and I needed a job. And so my chief, Sam Feinberg, asked me if I would like to join him and his son in practice. Sam was the head when I arrived, but a year later, Roy Patterson took over, and you probably know his name. He then became chairman of internal medicine at,
Yes.
at Northwestern. So Sam Feinberg was like a father to me. Alan, his son, was like a brother. So I joined them. And I'll never forget, it was a Saturday morning, and I gave 120 injections and came home and said to Albert, "Okay, now we're really going to get busy about finding an academic position." And in the year that had passed, there were 3 opportunities. And the one that was the most appealing, an opportunity to start a new allergy immunology division, was, strangely enough, St. Louis University. So for the 3rd time, we came back, and in 1965, I started the division. I told my chairman, Tom Frawley, that at least initially, I wanted to be known as an internist with an interest in allergy and immunology. So I was the 6th full-time member of the department. The 2 of our full-time members were at the VA. And so for 5 years, I attended on the general medicine floors on a regular basis for 5 years. And then we added some new faculty. And so I went down to 6 months a year. And I remember Tom calling me in after that period. He said, "I'm looking at what you've been doing. You've been publishing and presenting and writing abstracts in a chapter or 2. And I said, well, it maybe had something to do with the fact that I had some time, maybe 6 months of the year, to concentrate, on allergy and immunology. So the department grew, and I found St. Louis University to be a wonderful environment. I was particularly struck by the cooperation and collaboration that went on both in research and in teaching. We set up some very innovative interdisciplinary teaching. I collaborated with a number of people. I think I figured out once that I think I published with 10 or 12 individuals in different departments other than internal medicine. So it's been a wonderful career. I think I had the best of all possible worlds, teaching, taking care of patients, and doing research. So I think it was the best of all worlds for me. The university established Raymond and Alberta professorship in allergy and immunology. And I said at the ceremony that I reflected on someone who told me once that you should try and find a job you would do for free and then let them pay you. I looked around and there was Father Biondi standing there who paid my salary, thinking, oh my God, all these years we could have just not bothered to pay him. But I'm just one of those fortunate people who looked forward every single day to going to work. And by the same token, I also look forward every evening to come home to Alberta.
Let me ask you, go into a little bit more depth on some of the things you said. So you would have graduated from college in 1952, is that right?
Correct.
And so you went directly to medical school?
Correct.
So I'm curious why you chose to go to Michigan rather than Ohio State. I would have, of course, that at the time, maybe the tuition wasn't that much different. Today, I would think that it would be a lot more expensive to go out of state to Michigan than to stay in state and go to Ohio State.
Yeah, well, as I said, being an only child and in an era when there were not many day camps, I went off to an 8-week sleepaway camp when I was 5 years old, and I was the youngest and the smallest, but I just loved it. I just being with a bunch of kids my own age. And so every summer I went to a camp, and one summer, I think I was 12, a year before my bar mitzvah, went to a camp in the Irish Hills of Michigan, Camp Machaya. And our counselor was a student at the university, and he took our cabin into Ann Arbor, and we ended up at a very favorite lunch place that had booths and lamps with shades that came out of the wall, and students would write their names. And I looked up, and there was Tommy Harmon. You're maybe too young to remember Tommy.
No, I remember Tommy Harmon. He
All-American football player.
All-American football player whose son Mark has turned into a TV star.
Very good. Yes, yes. And Dan, I know it sounds ridiculous. I looked at that and I said, that's where I'm going to go to school. And as I said, I only applied to Michigan. My brother, as I said, went to Ohio State, and my mother used to say that at the Michigan-Ohio State football game, she always prayed for a tie. Yeah, it was strange. That's how I ended up in Ann Arbor.
So then again, I question about, I think particularly younger viewers have no idea how much more expensive medical schools are now than they were then, even in real dollars. But still, I would have thought it would have been more expensive to go to St. Louis University than, say, Ohio State University. How did you happen to choose St. Louis University?
Basically then, because of the three physicians with whom I was the closest. They were all graduates of St. Louis University. Interestingly, they were all Jewish. And I was very much influenced by them. I was accepted at Ohio State and St. Louis U and Washington U. And because these three physicians were so impressive to me, I chose St. Louis U. And after I was there a couple of months, I was walking down a hallway outside the dean's office that had pictures of the graduating classes. And I went right to 1936, 37, 38. And I was struck by the fact that the classes were full of Rabinowitzes, Slavin, Epstein, etc. And then I found out that in the 1930s, right up to the Second World War, there was a notorious quota at medical schools for Jewish pre-meds, with the exception of St. Louis U. They accepted people, because of their capability. And I remember
very interested to hear that, because I was on the faculty at Georgetown for a period of several years early in my career, and I had a couple of close student friends. I was a young faculty member, and I had a couple of close student friends who were Jewish, and they said that it was a well-known secret, a poorly concealed secret, that Georgetown at the time had a quota of a maximum of 10% of students being Jewish. So I was going to ask about St. Louis University. I believe that Ritter and some of the other leaders in the church in the 40s and 50s in St. Louis were leaders in civil rights, and in fact led integration efforts, early in the 50s in St. Louis. And so I was curious whether that extended to the medical school, and it sounds like it did.
St. Louis University admitted its first Black student way before other schools in the state, and the Catholic schools were the first to integrate. So people ask me, well, what's a nice Jewish boy from Cleveland doing at a Jesuit institution? But my religion was always treated with great respect. I was really drawn, as I said earlier, to the spirit of collaboration that went on with regard to both teaching and research. So that's how I ended up here.
Yeah, it must have been quite a time. Another good friend of mine, who's an internist who went to Cornell to medical school and then trained with me in medicine, described his interview at Harvard as, there's no other way to interpret it other than as flagrantly anti-Semitic, and this was in 69, or, it would have been in 1969. So.
Well, I had a cousin, Alfred Friedman, who was one of the premier psychiatrists in the country, wrote the definitive text for medical students, residents, and was also president of the American Psychiatric Association. And he went to Cornell, undergraduate, and applied to the medical school. And at the interview, the faculty member said, "What does your father do?" And he said he owns a clothing store in Minneapolis. And he looked him in the eye and said, "I'd suggest that you join your father's business." And this was before the Second World War, in the late 30s. And Paul Reiner, the president of St. Louis U, for many, many years, told me that his favorite time of the year was the winter, when he would go to Florida. He loved golf, but he also said, I met with all of these retired Jewish physicians who had gone to St. Louis U. And he said, Ray, they just opened up their wallets to me. They were so generous, you know, because in those days there were no Caribbean schools. So
Sure.
a lot of Jewish pre-meds went to Vienna, Brussels, France, to many places in Europe. You mentioned the cost. Again, I was fortunate that my mother and father had a small but very profitable furniture store, and every year my mother would send me a $1,200 fee for medical school. Alberta taught in the St. Louis school system, so we were very comfortable during medical school.
So a little bit about medical school. Was Phil Tumulty the chair when you were in school, or was that later?
Oh, what a good memory you have. Yeah, Phil Tumulty came in my second year with Tom Van Meter, George Zubrod from Johns Hopkins. And in a terrible instance, the sisters at St. Mary's had promised Phil Tumulty a certain number of beds, and they reneged on it. And I believe that they were here no more than 2 years,
Right.
And took offense at this, as rightly they should have, and they left. And the university was actually severely criticized by the American board, and it was a dark period.
Yeah, he packed up and went back to Hopkins, I believe, and I believe they, and then basically served, if I recall correctly, he served as the chief of service on what's now the Marburg, or what was called the Marburg service, the private service at Hopkins. Subsequent to that.
Oh yeah,
So,
they were readily accepted back at Hopkins. So
Sure.
it was very unfortunate. I was fortunate enough in my second and third year to have them as teachers and mentors.
What was it like being a clerk on the wards in the 1950s?
Oh,
What was your day? What was your day like? What did you do?
well, at that time, we spent a good deal of our experience at City Hospital, and the medical students did everything, including transporting patients to radiology. We did all the blood work, the urinalysis. I remember encountering my first problem being colorblind and trying to do a Zeal-Nielsen stain for tuberculosis. And it was very difficult for me to see the red stain. I had a lot of trouble looking at eosinophils, but it was a very, very broad experience. And as I said, I went back to Ann Arbor, and honestly, Dan, my internship was much easier than my senior year in medical school. We were expected to do everything. Fortunately, there were very good mentors at City Hospital, but it was grim as far as the time spent at the hospital.
I assume you had a little laboratory on each ward.
Oh yes, oh yeah, and we would perform the white counts and the urinalyses.
Yeah, we used to say that you could tell who the internal medicine residents were, and the students on internal medicine, because they had pink and purple fingers. Of course, back in the day, nobody wore gloves for much of anything, actually, and of course, we were all, our hands and our coat sleeves were all covered with the various stains that we use, the Gram stains and the Zeal-Nielsen stains and so on. You red-green colorblind? Is that your?
Yes.
That must have been very difficult.
Well, the first time that I encountered it was in biochemistry, looking at phenolphthalein endpoints. And as I recall, it was a pink, and I was just hopeless in terms of shades of color. I did also, I really became very proficient at venipunctures, and it stood me in very good stead during my residency and even fellowships. I could find the antecubital vein almost all the time.
I recall when I was in school, I don't think arterial blood gases were probably routine when you were in school. I know that I remember sitting with a surgical resident talking about how they used to draw blood gases and then all gather around and debate endlessly about what they meant. So because it was so unusual. And I'm curious to know, were portable EKG machines available when you were a student?
Yes, yeah. Mhm.
So you did your own, I assume single channel EKG
Mhm.
with the suction cups and that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
We
So
did a great deal of, I had one experience when I was early in my attending career. The house staff banquet was sometime during the week. And I said to my resident, um, I'll cover for you, but please come back. You know, not enthusiastic about spending the entire night. And he thanked me, and on his way out, he said, and I was sitting in a ward with several students, and he said, "Oh, tell me, is there anything, I hope you don't mind my asking, is there anything in particular that you would be a little concerned about?" And I said, well, I guess it would be mostly a cardiac arrest, because I know when to use the defibrillators, et cetera, but I don't know how. And the junior students said, oh, that's good. I don't know when to do it, but I do know how. So we thought we'd make a great team. I would say, okay, now.
so this was in when your senior year, when you were, and it would have been in 1956 then, is that right?
Actually, when I was an attending.
Oh, I see, an attending. Okay. I was going to say, because Kuvenhoven, I think Kuvenhoven and Blaylock had given Kuvenhoven surgical residence every year for several years and precluded his publishing his early findings until he did more work. And so Zoll stole a march on him at the Beth Israel and actually reported the first human defibrillation, although Kuvenhoven had been working on it for 15 or 20 years. And I think the first human defibrillation at Hopkins was done around 1956 or 57 by Mary Betty Stevens. And she was the chief resident at the time. And there was a wealthy baker who was brought into the emergency room in cardiac arrest, and the local medics, which were were trying this newfangled CPR on him. And apparently Dr. Stevens broke into Kuvenhoven's lab and brought this large bulky defibrillator down to the emergency room and defibrillated him successfully, as I might say. And he so the story goes, he went on to become a major donor to Hopkins. But I think Kuvenhoven, Knickerbocker, and Jude didn't publish their CPR findings until 1960 or thereabouts. So I think, and I think the first sort of widespread use didn't occur till the early 1960s. So I was curious about that. Yeah. So what was it like being a resident? And obviously there were no work hours. What was your call schedule like?
Sometimes every other night. I think more often every third night. And it was a very good general experience, both at City and at the University Hospital. It was known as Firmin Deloge Hospital. Right. There were very few full-time people. Rene Wegria was the chairman of medicine when I came for my internal medicine residency, and he brought two very good people from Columbia, George Curran and Dan Azernoff. And it was a terrific experience, but a lot of responsibility. I actually worked in Dan's lab looking for ubiquinone when I was a medical resident. And that really cemented my feelings about academic medicine. And, and that experience, coupled with my exposure to allergy, prompted me to think that it was a new and not a well-accepted specialty, but one that I really thought had tremendous possibilities in terms of research. I mean, IgE wasn't discovered until the first year of my fellowship. And we had, as far as treating asthmatics, all we had was aminophylline and corticosteroids. In my senior year, and aminophylline was available only IV and per rectum. And my senior year of medical school at City Hospital Clinic, a classmate came in and said, "Come see this patient with me." I walked in the room, was an older woman with asthma. And he said, "Tell Dr. Slavin what you told me." She said, "Well, I took that aminophylline, and for all the good it did, I could have shoved it up my ass." So it was extraordinary. And you know, hospitalized patients were very, very common. And then in 1976, the inhaled corticosteroid became available. And that changed our whole specialty. I mean, it really was transformed the specialty to one in which the majority of our patients improved. So I deal in a specialty that in which you literally change people's lives with the appropriate medication. And
yeah, I think it's really been remarkable. You know, aminophylline, you know, certainly was helpful, but we made many people very sick with aminophylline, theophylline, pushing it to the limits. And I think, you know, asthma inpatients have all but disappeared, you know, as compared to 30, 40 years ago. I think the other thing is that, you know, now that nobody uses aminophylline anymore, it's completely out of fashion. Multifocal atrial tachycardia has also pretty much disappeared as a dysrhythmia. You know,
well, I haven't heard. I know, Dan, that I think about 10 years ago, aminophylline was still the most widely used medication around the world.
Yeah,
very, you know, very much available. Fortunately, no longer suppositories. But I remember when the first oral aminophylline or theophylline came, Theodore, which was a very important breakthrough.
right. I think the fashion has changed. You know, it was almost like a switch went off, and residents and fellows and just stopped using aminophylline. And I think it was a bit too far. You know, I think it's a decent bronchodilator and doesn't need to be pushed to toxicity to have some effectiveness. So I think it's still got a useful place in the armamentarium. But you know, you could wander around the hospital and not find anybody on any kind of theophylline anymore. So what was your social life like as a resident? I interviewed Bill Fogarty earlier, who was roughly, you know, your era in St. Louis. He told me that, you know, the social life for the married residents tended to center around other married residents. Was that similar for you?
Yes, yeah. With the limited time that we had, it was pretty busy. We became acquainted with some neighbors in Clayton, and I knew a number of them beforehand, but the social life was very, very limited. As I said, our first child was born just before residency, before graduation. Our second son was born in Fort Huachuca. Third son was born during my residency, and our fourth child, a daughter, was born during my fellowship. So it was hectic. I remember very little about the symphony or opera, theater. Social life was very, very limited.
Did the attending sometimes give you tickets for various and sundry social things like the theater or opera?
Yes, yeah. And as I remember, the St. Louis Symphony also had free tickets. So we took advantage of that, with Alberta being a very talented violinist. She played in the St. Louis Philharmonic when I was a resident. And so I would take the kids to hear her play. And when I came back as a faculty member, she played with the St. Louis String Ensemble, concerts at Fontbonne, which was close to our home. So she afforded particular opportunities in music.
So tell me a little bit about your fellowship. Of course, I think I didn't recognize the name of your first division chief. And it sounds like he was in private practice while running the division.
Correct.
Patterson, of course, is legendary, not least for having written all those articles on ABPA, many of which have a tendency to resemble one another. But what was it like being a fellow in that? I gather that must have been kind of a leading group of academic allergists. Is that right?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. In those days, I'm not sure there were more than 15 or 20 training programs. And so I was very impressed. Actually, I met Roy when I was an intern at the University of Michigan, and he was an allergy fellow at that time. He consulted on some of our patients. So it was sort of old home week. It was just a wonderful program in terms of patient care, wonderful opportunities for research. I got a master's degree in medicine at that time. I don't know if that's even offered anymore, but I did a lot of reading, took some immunology classes, presented my thesis before a board. And so that absolutely cemented my desire to go somewhere full time. It was just a great exposure. There's just lots of encouragement and many activities going on, good opportunities for collaboration.
I think by that point, the NIH was funding these subspecialty fellowships. So the pay was a little better. Is that right, than it was being a resident?
Yeah, I was an NIH fellow. I think I got $1,200 a year. At the University of Michigan, I got $100 a month, out of which they took $60 for cleaning my uniforms. The Army was an absolute eye-opener, because I went from $100 a month, well, basically $40 a month, but I think $7,000 a year, with people saluting me all the time, and shopping at the PX, and we had a home that the Army provided. That was the only time in our life when we literally did not know how to spend our money. We were 70 mile, and it was the Army electronic proving ground, because there was the least amount of interference from television and radio waves. So the closest town was Tombstone, the town too tough to die. And so the 2 years there were extremely enjoyable.
Yeah, I think young people today, accustomed to both the extremely high tuitions and the, by historic standards, the high rate of pay for house staff, have a difficulty understanding. I remember I had Alvin Feinstein as a visiting professor once, and he was an intern at Columbia, where in the early 50s, where his pay was $25 a month. And I worked with a physician in rural Nebraska while I was in medical school. I went back and took an elective there, and he had done 2 years of rotating internship at Cook County, and the city hospitals were sufficiently competitive then that he actually had to take an examination to obtain a spot there.
Oh,
And they paid him $40 a month, plus room, board, and uniforms. You know, he could live in the hospital, he could eat the hospital food, and they would give him his uniforms, plus $40 a month. And he said that basically covered his shoes and his haircuts. Yeah, I was interested to hear that you had an internist when you were a child, because I think at the time, about 80% of the doctors in the United States were GPs, and internists were, I think, internal medicine specialists, I think, were somewhat unusual. Do you recall him and what he was like?
oh yes, yeah. Herschel Cohen, and I can't tell you where outside of the medical school at St. Louis U, I don't know what his training was, but we met him when he first took care of my father at Mount Sinai Hospital in Cleveland. My mother refused an autopsy, but I'm pretty sure it was, he died in my senior year in high school. And he was jaundiced, and my guess is biliary tract cancer. And Herschel Cohen took care of my father then, and we were very impressed with him. And I guess he was a resident. And so then he took over the internal medicine care of my family. I interacted with him. He did arrange, now that I think of it, he did arrange for me to spend a summer fellowship at Mount Sinai Hospital, where my Dick Ock was active some years later. And
yeah, Dick was as you know, I'm sure that that hospital no longer exists in its
right.
original form, and Dick was the last chief of medicine there. And I'm actually interested in the history of Jewish hospitals. I became aware, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, how many of the Jewish hospitals in the United States have gone defunct. And it seems to me pretty clear that the two major reasons for that are the diminishment in anti-Semitism, so that residents who could previously not get positions at non-Jewish hospitals could now do so.
Yeah.
The other thing, which was interesting to me when I visited Einstein in Philadelphia, I met with the board of directors, and as you may know, that hospital is in an area that was formerly Jewish and is now largely, Afro-Caribbean and Hispanic immigrants.
Yeah.
And I asked the board, I said, I'm curious to know how it is that you didn't follow your original constituency to the suburbs. When the Jewish population that lived there migrated out to the suburbs, why did the hospital not do so? Because, many secular and other faith-based hospitals have done exactly that. They picked up, and St. Louis is a perfect example, St. John's, St. Luke's, Missouri Baptist, St. Anthony's, DePaul, all used to be in the city limits,
Sure.
and they're all now in the suburbs. And with very few exceptions, the Jewish hospitals didn't do that. And I asked the board of directors why they didn't do it. They said, well, we talked about it, we thought about it, we decided it was not the ethical thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Decided that our duty was to serve the population who lived around us,
Mm-hmm.
even if it was not the population that we originally were founded to serve.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was both noble and ultimately sacrificial, because about the only Jewish hospitals that are surviving and thriving are those that are currently in Jewish areas and cities where there's a significant population, like Cedar Sinai in Los Angeles, the Beth Israel in Boston, and Mount Sinai in New York. And as you may know, the Beth Israel in Boston is not in its original location. It, along with Sinai and Hopkins, is one of them that actually did move. And the original Beth Israel was in Dorchester, and it moved over to Brookline. And the original Mount Sinai in Baltimore was pretty close to Hopkins and moved into the near north suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them stayed where they were. So it's a really interesting thing. And I think it's worth recording at some point. I'm not aware that anybody has done so.
Mm-hmm.
I've been talking with Freddie Shipman, who's a friend of mine at Miriam in Providence, and we're talking about maybe putting together a book about it. So So the other thing that I think would be foreign to many of the younger listeners here was the very small size of your departments. Now, departments in medical schools, departments of medicine in medical schools, like Hopkins, like UCLA, like WashU, like Penn, and so on, will have 450 or 500 members of the Department of Medicine.
Mhm.
And I remember talking to Dave Kipnis one time, and he told me that when he took over the Department of Medicine at WashU, that the number of full-time faculty members, both at based at Barnes and based at Jewish, was around 50.
Mm.
And you told me that the number of full-time faculty members at St. Louis University in the early 60s was 6, I believe.
Mhm. I was the sixth full-time member.
There's just been this explosive growth in full-time faculties in the United States, mostly clinical. So can you tell me a little bit about, I was interested, I think, to read in your CV that you were the program director for internal medicine for a period of time.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, again, our ranks were thin. And, I can't remember who my predecessor was, but I was asked by Tom Frawley to head the program. At that time, the internal medicine residents rotated through Furman Deloge, the VA, city, county, and Bethesda. So it was a job. I actually had a full-time secretary who took care of that while I had another secretary in allergy and immunology. So placing the residents in different locations was a task. It was also a day, Dan, as you know, when residents were pretty compliant. and I don't remember any disciplinary problems. We had a lot of foreign medical graduates. And I did that for 12 years, and then Frawley resigned, and I was acting chair of the department for a year before Steve Ayers came. As an aside, that 1 year was enough to convince me that I was not the person for a full-time chair. It was not the position for me. And Roy Patterson and others urged me to throw my hat in the ring, as it were. And Steve Ayers came, and we met not long after he'd arrived. He said, I want to thank you for all you've done. I'd like to appoint you to whatever position you'd like. You could be associate chairman. And I said, Steve, if there was one thing I would wish upon myself, would be to be out of the residency training program directorship. It really just took a lot of time. So that's when I left. I think I was probably program director for 12 years, something like that.
So I met Tom Frawley late in his life when we were both members, as you are, of the St. Louis Society of Internal Medicine. Mm-hmm. And I met him late in life, and he either was or had recently completed his term as being chair at St. John's, as it was called at the time.
Yeah.
How did he happen to leave St. Louis U? Was there friction over the way the department was running or something?
There was, and of course I was very new, and I was not in the total loop, but there was a cabal of 3 or 4 people, most of them at the VA, and they objected to many things he was doing. I always found him to be a very supportive. Of course, and he said to me, frankly, when he interviewed me, it was allergy was not high on my list, but the people around here who knew you seemed to think that you'd be a good faculty member, and so that's when he hired me. But there was a group of 3 or 4 in the department who felt that he just wasn't the right person. I thought he was a wonderful teacher, and a good administrator. The big problem he had was not being able to delegate responsibilities. I'm sure Bill Fogarty about those kinds of problems. He had an ego that was as big as the Grand Canyon, but he was always very, very supportive of me, and I enjoyed him. I thought he was a good chair. He recruited some extremely good people, and I thought the department was moving along. We were having a good group of residents. So I really was not part of the cabal. I don't know, but he resigned. He was just encountering a lot of problems, both in the dean's office and also by this small group, largely at the VA.
Were you the first allergist in St. Louis?
Oh no. As I mentioned, Clem Sullivan was the first certified allergist, and he, of course, this was before fellowship programs. He spent a year with an allergist in Virginia in his private office, and then took his boards. Charlie Parker was already at Washington U. There were I can't tell you how many. I would guess there were 12 or 15 allergists in the St. Louis area. And it's interesting, you know, it's still
Interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I talk about the most common chronic diseases in the United States, and well over half of American medical schools don't have a full-time allergist. There's never been an allergist at the University of Missouri, not in their entire history. There's no allergist at Illinois and Springfield. So we're educating a generation of medical students with little or no exposure to allergy and immunology.
It's too bad. As you know, I'm a pulmonologist, and I came to believe over the course of my career that allergists do a much better job of managing asthma than the typical pulmonologist. And
I agree totally.
You so seldom see, again, back in the days when there were more asthma patients in the hospital than there are now, you seldom see the patient of an allergist as an inpatient. Frequently see the patient's pulmonologist as inpatients. And I think it had to do with outpatient management and the fact that, that many pulmonologists have their activities are divided. They have large inpatient consultative practices, and whereas allergists by and large don't. And my eyes were opened to that. Interesting enough, I Phil Kornblatt. I went out and watched his practice for a while. I was contemplating how to get more outpatient training for our residents. I ultimately put residents in his practice because his practice was so well run. But leads me to another thing. I also came to believe that during my time here in St. Louis, that the division at St. Louis University was a better clinical division than the division at Washington University. The division at WashU was pretty strong in terms of investigation because of Charlie Parker and Dave Chaplin and people like that. But my perception was that you guys were the better clinical allergy division. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, I think we were. But you strike a very responsive chord in terms of pulmonology and allergy and their care of asthma. Pulmonologists know everything about the devices, and certainly they're very experienced in hospitalized patients and ventilators and the like. What they don't understand, Dan, is environmental control. They really know nothing about how to instruct a patient whose house dust mite sensitive, for example, cat and dog sensitive. So I think that's one of the biggest differences, the failure to understand how important controlling the environment is. And then interpreting skin tests. Um, and then finally, immunotherapy, in the patients who are not responding appropriately to environmental control and medications. So they have very little understanding of the patients who are placed on immunotherapy when they don't respond to the other medications.
Well, I have to say, this has been now almost 30 years ago now, but nevertheless, by that point, I had been a physician for nearly 20 years and had trained in pulmonary disease. And when I visited Phil's office was the first time I saw patients being taught to use a peak flow meter to monitor their pre-symptomatic state and manage their medications and so on. I'm curious, there are a few divisions around the United States where allergy and pulmonary are together, Vanderbilt, Duke, Boston University, a few others. Do you think their fellows, I don't know if you've had a chance to come into contact, do you think their fellows are better trained and more responsive to allergy than fellows from straight pulmonary divisions or not?
Oh, you mean divisions in which pulmonary and allergy are combined?
Together, yeah.
Yeah, that's not the case at St. Louis U, as you probably know. When Dan Hoft was considering moving because he was not a division director, Bob Belshie was the longtime head of infectious diseases at St. Louis U, and he started the vaccine center, which has continued. So Adrian D. Biscelli asked me if I would mind moving my division of allergy and immunology into a different division of immunobiology. It would be a division of internal medicine. And I was confident enough in my state that I did not mind, being a part of a division of immunobiology. And then Bob Belshie retired, and then Dan took over the division of infectious diseases. So we're now part of infectious diseases, which I think, particularly from a research point, is very advantageous to it. There's a cadre of young, bright PhDs in the Doisy Research Center. And I keep urging our fellows to take advantage of this opportunity. So I think it's appropriate. I know the head of allergy at Vanderbilt, Stokes Peebles, and I didn't realize that they're now part of pulmonology.
I believe they are. I believe they are. When Peggy came to St. Louis to be the chief of the division of allergy, she described Tim Blackwell as being her boss. He's the head of pulmonary and pulmonary and allergy. And then, interestingly enough, as part of that search, we interviewed a couple of people from the Brigham, and they're part of a division of rheumatology and allergy.
Yes, yeah, that's very common. That's
and I think that may have to do with the fact basically the kind of research that K. Frank Austin did at the old Breck. So
you mentioned a lot of very familiar names.
Yeah. So what do you think has changed the most about your practice and your ability to help patients over the last now nearly 60 years?
Oh, I think without question, the inhaled corticosteroids, the dual medications we have now, corticosteroids and long-acting bronchodilators, that has made a huge impact and really transformed the lives of patients and allergists. About 10 years ago, I started an inner city asthma and allergy clinic on North Kings Highway, what native St. Louisans know as the Sears building, now the Victor Roberts building.
Right.
And it's extraordinary. We had a wonderful arrangement with Merck. We could get free Dulera inhalers were sent to the patients, and it was transformative, absolutely transformative. As an aside, Dan, and you may have some ideas about this, I'm not attracting the number of patients that I thought I would. Asthma, as you know, is more common and more severe in the inner city, but our return rate is terrific because they're on appropriate medications and doing well. But I have had real problems attracting patients, and particularly kids.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I've talked to several people more conversant with inner city medicine than I, and uniformly, the first thing they come up with is trust. The patients don't trust the medical schools. They think that we're there for research, and they are our subjects. And I heard that from several people who first thing that they comment on is the lack of trust. So I'm not sure what to do about that. We've made every effort to reach out. I've spoken to several churches about, giving short talks about asthma and about the advantages of seeing, coming to our clinic and being put on appropriate medications, but it's a very hard nut to crack.
Well, the history of racial discrimination in St. Louis is pretty vicious, and it certainly includes the schools. The old Jewish on this side of town, the old Jewish hospital desegregated well before Barnes did, and Barnes has the worst reputation. And I think BJH inherited some of that. And if you look at the records and the pictures and the segregated wards and so on, and so on, it's hard to argue with that perception. And I well recall when I was a medical student, a fellow joking, this would have been 1971 or 72 thereabouts, a fellow joking that informed consent was, we're going to take you for a little test now, Mr. Jones, all right? that was informed consent. And so I think it's that, and of course that the Black population in St. Louis is intimately familiar with the stories of Tuskegee and other stories. So I think we have to walk the walk for another generation before we can expect to be trusted. The other thing is that, again, I think that I think representation is important. I think we need to have more young Black physicians, who are visible and active in the community and so on. And there's an issue which nobody talks about, which is in itself, I think, a kind of a form of de facto discrimination. This idea that if we admit more Black kids to medical school, that they will then go and practice in the underserved areas, which is in fact telling them that they should go there rather than go into the wealthier suburbs, right?
Yes.
Where the economic opportunities and so on are greater, and I think that strikes kind of a sour note as well. This idea that we'll admit you to medical school if you'll go and take care of your kind. I just think that's not a very attractive posture for medical schools to take.
I was, early on in my academic career, I served on the Minority Admissions Committee.
Yeah, I saw that.
And we actually went to predominantly Black colleges. One thing we found was what I call binocular vision. They knew about the largely Black medical schools and Harvard. That was it. So we admitted 12 Black students, and we had from these schools, and we had a summer program, a bridging program. And make a long story short, the majority, failed, flunked out. They just did not have the educational background. And I think the summer bridging program was a nice effort and well meant, but not adequate. there was one Black in my medical school class of 1956. We still fall, a little bit short. My second oldest son, Stuart, who you maybe know, was Associate Dean for Curricular Affairs, and he made efforts. I can't tell you what the first year class at St. Louis U now is comprised of. More than half I know are women. And we've done a little bit better, but we still have a very small number of Black medical students.
Yeah, it's again, I think it's a function of the historic systemic racism that impacts on economic opportunities, educational opportunities, and so on, that does this. I've been struck by the difference in, I think, self-esteem and self-confidence displayed by Black kids who grew up in Canada or the Caribbean, as opposed to Black kids that grew up in the United States. And the lesson I've drawn from them is that it's enormously toxic to grow up Black in the United States. I think it's the kids from Canada and the Caribbean seem to be, I don't know, have a more healthy self-view. And I think that the difference is the environment from which they come. So,
well, one of my activities in my semi-retired state is being a ready reader. I read to 3 to 5 year old kids, very satisfying, but eye-opening when 3 or 4 times a year, ready readers give the kids books. And what the procedure is, you read the book the week before, and then the following week you read the book again, and then you pass out the books and we read them together. And Dan, 3, 4, 5 year old kids have no concept of turning pages. Forever the teacher's running around. I say, okay, are we literally and figuratively on the same page? Because they'll turn it back. Obviously, they've had nobody who would put them on their lap and read to them. So just turning pages. So that's very discouraging. And I think by the time they're ready for kindergarten, they have a woeful vocabulary. Something like 2,000 words less than a kid in Clayton or Ladue. So the disparity is very.
Well, our time is getting close to being up, or maybe a little over. You advise students to become internists?
Yes, yeah. And I have a particular proclivity for allergy and immunology. I gotta say that when medical residents come through our clinic, and they've come from GI, or they're dealing with pancreatic cancer and irritable bowel syndrome, and they come from pulmonary, where lung cancer and sarcoidosis, and then they come to our clinic, and they often remark, everybody here seems a lot happier than they are in other clinics. And I think it's because we deal largely with reversible diseases, treatable diseases. So I'm a great advocate for my particular specialty. But I think internal medicine, and I'm very pleased at internal medicine is by far the most common choice of residencies for senior medical students at St. Louis U.
If you were given the opportunity to change anything or things about the way you've lived your life or career, are there any things that you would do differently?
No. Professionally, as I said earlier, I can't imagine, a better career, combining those 3 aspects. And I throw in administration along with teaching, patient care and research. I've had some good opportunities. Personally, I had 55 years with a remarkable wife. So I have 4 children and 6 grandkids. 2 weeks ago, one of my granddaughters graduated from the University of Michigan in medical school. And just before the recessional at the ceremony, the MC asked the seniors to stand to recite the Hippocratic Oath. And he said, and if there are any physicians in the audience, stand up and join us. And so Stuart, my son, was sitting next to me. We stood up and we could see over in the other student section, Alana, my granddaughter, standing up and looking at 3 generations of Slavin physicians. So it was very satisfying.
Yep, we've lived charmed lives, and yours has been very, very productive and distinguished. Well, thank you for talking with me today.